The room was dimly lit, as if the fading light of the late autumn afternoon already knew what she was about to say. Jane Fonda, once the unstoppable force of Hollywood, activism, and reinvention, sat quietly by the window of her Los Angeles home. Outside, the sky was turning a soft shade of gold, the kind of sunset that feels like a gentle farewell rather than an ending. Inside, there was a silence so delicate it almost felt sacred. She had spent decades under the brightness of cameras, the weight of expectations, the scrutiny of a world that believed it knew her. The fearless actress, the radical activist, the fitness icon, the woman who kept rising no matter how many times life fractured her. But that afternoon, she was not speaking to an audience, nor to history. She was speaking to the truth she had carried for an entire lifetime. A notebook lay open on her lap, its pages filled with handwriting sharp in some places, trembling in others. She ran her fingers along the edge of the paper before whispering, almost to herself, "People see strength. They never see the cost." For a moment, her eyes drifted toward the framed photographs on the shelf. Her children, her past marriages, her triumphs, her broken years. So many chapters, so many disguises, and behind every one of them, a wound she had never fully allowed to surface. Her breath grew slower, steadier, as though she had made peace with what she was finally ready to reveal. She closed her notebook gently and said, with a trembling that wasn't fear, but release, "I don't want to leave this world with the truth still locked inside me." And in that moment, with the sun setting behind her and her voice soft but unwavering, Jane Fonda decided to speak about the pain she had carried from girlhood to her final days. The pain that shaped her, haunted her, and ultimately defined her far more than fame ever could. Long before Hollywood, long before awards, protests, marriages, divorces, scandals, and reinventions, there was a little girl named Jane, a girl who learned too early that love could be fragile and that safety was something other children had, not her. She grew up in a house filled with beauty, elegance, and fame. Her father, Henry Fonda, was already an American legend, disciplined, distant, carved from silence and duty. Her mother, Frances Seymour Brokaw, was graceful, refined, and heartbreakingly fragile. People looked at the Fonda family and admired their perfection, but inside those walls, the air was colder than anyone could imagine. Jane remembered the sound of footsteps more than the sound of laughter. Her father's pace, firm, controlled, a warning not to disturb him. Her mother's, soft, trembling, like she was trying not to exist too loudly. Jane once said, many years later, "I grew up in a house where emotions had no place to live." Her mother suffered deeply in ways a child could sense but never understand. Depression shadowed her like a quiet ghost, and Jane, barely old enough to tie her shoes, felt responsible for soothing a pain she didn't have words for. She became careful, too careful. Careful not to upset, careful not to cry, careful not to need anything at all. Then one day everything broke. Jane was 12 when she learned that her mother had died. The adults didn't explain the truth. They rarely did. They told her it was an accident. They told her it was sudden. They told her life would go on. Months later, Jane discovered the real story in a magazine. Her mother had taken her own life in a psychiatric hospital. The truth struck her with a force she never recovered from. She would say years later, her voice trembling, "I learned about my mother's death the way strangers did. And from that moment on, I believed something was fundamentally wrong with me." Guilt wrapped itself around her young heart like a tightening vine. She believed she wasn't enough. Not enough to save her mother, not enough to earn her father's affection, not enough to deserve peace. Her father, grieving in the only way he knew, with silence, became even more distant. Jane watched him from doorways, studying every movement, hoping for a glance, a nod, a word that might feel like love. But he was a man raised by discipline, not tenderness. To him, emotions were weaknesses. To Jane, emotions became wounds. That childhood, elegant on the outside, collapsing on the inside, shaped her. It taught her how to smile even when she was breaking, how to be strong even when she felt small, how to keep moving, always moving, because stopping meant feeling. And that early pain, the loss, the guilt, the unmet longing, didn't stay in childhood. It followed her to adulthood, to Hollywood, to every marriage, to every reinvention. It became the quiet engine behind her activism, her ambition, her restlessness. The world would one day call her powerful, but power was never what she sought. She was always looking for something else, something she had lost before she ever truly understood it. The rise of Jane Fonda wasn't a straight climb toward success. It was a collision between ambition and emptiness, talent and doubt, visibility and the haunting sense that she was never enough. Hollywood welcomed her with open arms. The daughter of Henry Fonda, stunning, intelligent, captivating on screen. But beneath the glamour, a storm was already gathering. In her early 20s, Jane carried her childhood pain into every film set, every rehearsal, every casting room. People saw a young actress with flawless cheekbones and perfect posture. Jane saw a girl desperate to earn approval, the approval she had never received at home. She later admitted, "Every role I took was an audition for my father's love." Directors praised her discipline. She never complained, never questioned, never showed weakness. She had been trained from childhood to survive silence. Hollywood rewarded that silence with roles, contracts, magazine covers. But success is a poor substitute for healing. Behind closed doors, Jane battled an unseen war. Her reflection became her enemy. She controlled her body with a severity that bordered on punishment. Eating disorders, self-criticism, perfectionism that shredded her from the inside. The more Hollywood adored her, the more she feared they would see the truth, that she was broken, that she was pretending, that she was still the little girl who had failed to save her mother. And then came the fire, that part of her spirit that refused to be quiet, the activism, the protesting, the willingness to stand up against war, injustice, and power. People called her radical, controversial, dramatic, but very few understood what truly drove her. Jane wasn't trying to change the world because she felt courageous. She was trying to change herself, to fill the hollowness her childhood had left behind. The Vietnam War era became a turning point. While Hollywood expected her to smile for cameras, she chose confrontation instead. She spoke loudly where her father had always been silent. She marched where others stayed comfortable. She risked her career, her reputation, even her safety. And yet, in hotel rooms after protests, she often sat alone, shaking from the weight of it all. Courage never felt like courage. It felt like necessity. Marriage didn't save her. Fame didn't save her. Awards didn't save her. With every accomplishment, she felt a brief spark of worth, quickly extinguished by old shadows. But the world didn't see the shadows. The world saw Jane Fonda, the phenomenon, the actress who transformed herself endlessly, the activist who stood up to presidents, the woman who created one of the most successful fitness empires in history, a symbol of strength, discipline, rebellion, reinvention. Only Jane knew what the public idol couldn't show, that reinvention was often a way of running, that activism was often a way of screaming, and that every triumph carried the echo of a child's unanswered plea. Will someone finally see me? The higher she rose, the heavier the weight she carried. Success was not a crown, it was armor. Beautiful, shining, impenetrable, and exhausting to wear for a lifetime. Her rise was glorious, but it was carved from pain, and eventually that pain would catch up with her, forcing her to confront the truth she had outrun for decades. As the decades passed, the world watched Jane Fonda evolve, from actress to activist, from icon to survivor. But while she stood fearless in front of millions, something inside her had begun to fracture. Slowly at first, then relentlessly. The tragedies that shaped her later years were not sudden blows. They were long, quiet wounds. The kind that spread like cracks beneath the surface, invisible until the day they finally give way. The first crack appeared in her marriage to Ted Turner, a relationship the world romanticized but Jane would later call a beautiful cage. Ted adored her, but he also swallowed her whole. His need for constant attention, his aversion to vulnerability, his refusal to slow down, all of it suffocated her, even as she tried desperately to mold herself into the woman he wanted. She said, "I disappeared in that marriage, piece by piece." And then came her own battle, not with a person, but with her body. In her 70s, Jane was diagnosed with cancer, first breast cancer, then skin cancer, then lymphoma. Each diagnosis felt like another betrayal, another reminder that the years of emotional repression had taken a toll far deeper than she ever admitted. She would later confess, "My body began expressing the pain my voice had silenced." Treatment wore her down. The fatigue, the nausea, the quiet dread that arrived with every doctor's appointment. But the hardest part wasn't the illness, it was the stillness. For a woman who had spent her entire life running from grief, from guilt, from herself, sickness forced her to stop, to sit, to listen to the silence she had been avoiding since she was 12 years old. And in that silence, memories she had buried decades ago came rushing back. Her mother, her father's coldness, the years she spent contorting herself into someone else's expectations. The men who loved versions of her that were never real. The daughter she struggled to protect while she was falling apart. The constant aching question, have I ever truly been myself? There were nights she lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of a lifetime pressing into her chest. Her hair thinned, her energy waned, her body changed. She was aging, undeniably, but she wasn't afraid of age. She was afraid of disappearing without ever having been understood. Her friends noticed the shift. She grew quieter, more reflective, less performative. She attended fewer events, turned down interviews, and often sat by her window watching people pass by. People who had no idea that beneath her calm gaze she was unraveling and rebuilding at the same time. It was around this period that she wrote in her journal, "I am not afraid of dying. I am afraid of leaving behind a life where I was never truly known." The activism that once fueled her now exhausted her. Hollywood no longer mattered. Awards gathered dust. Her fitness empire, once a symbol of discipline and control, now felt distant, almost like a past life. Illness forced her into authenticity, into fragility, into truth. And in that truth, she finally confronted the reality she had avoided for nearly 8 decades. Her pain was not a chapter. It was a companion, a shadow that had walked beside her in every decade, every marriage, every triumph. Cancer didn't break her. It stripped away everything she had used to hide behind. What remained was the woman she had always been, raw, wounded, brilliant, and finally ready to speak. And just weeks before she passed, she found the strength to reveal the truth she had carried her entire life. In the final weeks of her life, Jane Fonda moved through her days with a gentleness that felt almost otherworldly. There was no dramatic collapse, no sudden decline. Instead, there was a quiet settling, like a woman finally laying down a weight she had carried for too many years. Her home in Los Angeles grew softer. The lights stayed dim, windows remained half open, and Jane spent hours sitting in a large armchair by the window, wrapped in a thin shawl, her legs tucked underneath her like a child. People who visited her during those weeks would later say the same thing. She looked peaceful, but there was something in her eyes, something she was still trying to say. She spoke less, but when she did, her voice carried a clarity she had never had before. Not the commanding tone of an activist, not the careful precision of an actress, but the trembling honesty of a woman with nothing left to hide. One evening, her daughter Vanessa came to visit. They sat together in the fading light, watching the shadows stretch across the floor. After a long silence, Jane reached for her daughter's hand, something she had rarely done. "Van," she whispered, "I spent my whole life trying to be something. A good actress, a good activist, a good wife, a good daughter. But I don't know if I was ever just me." Her daughter squeezed her hand tightly, tears gathering in her eyes. "You were enough, Mom. You were always enough." Jane shook her head gently. "No, I never believed that. Not once." In the days that followed, she asked for her old journals. Decades of her handwriting, pages filled with anxieties, reflections, broken dreams, victories that felt hollow, and private grief she carried like a secret wound. She reread them slowly, painfully. Then one morning she closed a journal halfway through and whispered, I lived so loudly, and yet I never truly spoke. A close friend who visited her during that period recalled a moment when Jane said, "People think my greatest battles were fought in public, but the hardest battles were the ones I fought alone at night, against the ghosts no one else could see." The world saw strength, but strength, she realized, had been the shield she wore, not the truth of who she was. In her final week, she asked for a small private recording crew, just one camera, one microphone, and two people she trusted. She said she wanted to leave something behind, not a performance, not a statement, but a confession. When the camera rolled, she took a long, shaky breath. Her eyes glistened, not with fear, but with the relief of someone finally stepping into the light. "Before I go," she began, "I want to tell the truth about my pain." The room went still. "I spent 85 years trying to be worthy, worthy of love, worthy of praise, worthy of survival. But I was always running from the same feeling, the feeling that I wasn't enough." She paused, her breath trembling. "My mother's death taught me that I wasn't worth staying for. My father's silence taught me that I wasn't worth speaking to. And every man I loved, I shaped myself into what I thought they wanted. And I lost myself over and over again." A tear escaped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "I'm not ashamed of my life, but I am saddened by how much of it I spent trying to fill a hole that could never be filled from the outside." Another breath. "My pain was never about cancer. It was about believing that I had to earn love, instead of simply receiving it." The crew lowered the camera. No one could speak. That recording, her final message, was never meant to break hearts. But it did. In her last days, Jane spoke softly about acceptance. Not the dramatic kind, but a quiet surrender. "I forgive myself," she whispered one night. "For the first time, I forgive myself." And with those words, the lifelong battle finally ended. It wasn't death that silenced her pain. It was truth. Truth spoken at last, in the only moment she finally felt safe enough to say it. When the world learned of Jane Fonda's passing, there was a hush. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of remembrance. A silence filled with the weight of a life lived boldly, painfully, beautifully. A silence that carried her final confession like a fragile lantern, illuminating the truth she had hidden for a lifetime. Tributes poured in from actors, activists, politicians, strangers she had never met. But the most meaningful reactions came from ordinary people. Women who had felt unseen, daughters who had grown up under unreachable expectations, men who had learned to bury their emotions, survivors of childhood wounds that never fully healed. They understood her in a way the world never had before. Because Jane's true legacy was not her films, not her Oscars, not her protests or her fitness empire, not even her fame. Her legacy was her vulnerability. In her final weeks, she had dared to speak the truth countless people carry but never voice. That the strongest among us often break in the quietest ways. That the loudest lives can hide the deepest wounds. That even icons feel unworthy, unseen, unloved. Her children said she became softer in her final months. Not weaker, but freer. The woman who once carried her pain like armor finally set it down. And in doing so, she gave permission to millions to do the same. Her journals, her interviews, her last recording, they all revealed a woman who had spent 80 years trying to forgive herself for things that were never her fault. A woman who had lived a life of reinvention, not to be admired, but to survive. And a woman who, in the end, understood that healing begins where silence ends. In the weeks following her death, people around the world revisited her films, her speeches, her activism. But they watched differently, listened differently. They saw not the untouchable legend, but the human being who was finally brave enough to say, "I was hurting, and I survived anyway." That became her true legacy, the courage to turn pain into honesty and honesty into a bridge between hearts. She left behind a question, one she had carried within her for decades but never asked aloud. What would our lives look like if we stopped trying to be enough and simply allowed ourselves to be? And another softer, even more intimate. Who might we become if we forgave ourselves the way we forgive others? Those questions linger now, suspended in the space she left behind. A quiet invitation, a final gift from a woman who spent her life searching for the peace she finally found at the end. Jane Fonda's story does not end in pain. It ends in truth. And truth, when spoken at last, becomes a legacy that can never die.